Our story begins with Leo, who spent every penny he had, $400 scraped together for a dowry, on a 3-day wedding feast that ended in a scandal. Everyone thinks he's lost his mind from the shock, but only he knows this was the most important decision of his life. In his past life, he had foolishly forced his wife back home just to save face. That choice led to 70 years of misery, being betrayed and drained dry in a hopeless marriage. Now, he's more than happy to let someone else deal with that mess, and he turns to head home. But just then, a warm hand suddenly grips his arm. His younger brother, Lucas, is fuming, telling Leo that the Miller family has gone too far and he's going to settle the score. Leo turns to look at that youthful face, his eyes instantly welling with tears. This is the brother who, in another life, died of cancer at 43. Leo grips his hand back tightly. Suppressing the tremble in his voice, he tells Lucas they have more important things to do at home. He then shoots a cold look at his cheap father-in-law, Mr. Miller, warning him that if there isn't a proper explanation for this disaster, no one in their family will ever hold their heads up again. Mr. Miller is visibly shaken now, realizing his family is vastly outnumbered in this village. Without another word, Leo leads his brothers away, heading back up the dirt slope toward the old family house. The wedding banquet, which should have been filled with joy, is now deathly silent. Suddenly, his bitter stepmother, Sarah, spits on the ground in disgust. Right behind her, his father, Marcus, picks up a wooden stool with fire in his eyes and swings it toward Leo's head. Marcus screams that Leo is a useless coward, but Leo sidesteps the lethal blow and stares coldly at his own father. He tells him to stop the nonsense and bring Sarah out so they can settle things in front of all the relatives. Marcus is so livid his eyes are twitching. He's about to launch into a tirade when Sarah rushes out of the house and grabs him. With a mocking sneer, she says they should indeed make things clear. She claims that since the dowry money is already spent, Leo has to accept the debt, whether the wedding actually happened or not. At that moment, a small, cold hand clutches Leo's sleeve. He looks down to see his young sister, Lily, holding their 6-year-old brother, both of them trembling with fear. In that instant, Leo feels a sharp pang in his chest. He remembers how, just 2 months after Sarah entered the house, she had driven all 5 siblings into a life of ruin. In his previous life, he worked himself to the bone only to be forced into marrying the conniving Chloe. 10 years into that marriage, Chloe secretly had a sterilization procedure right after their daughter was born, leaving Leo to be the target of village gossip for the rest of his days. He lived to be 80 without a single day of peace, but having been given a second chance, he's relieved that Chloe ran off with someone else. As for this toxic household, he is determined to make a clean break today. Just then, his eldest uncle, Jacob, stands up and glares at Marcus. Jacob asks if splitting the family is really Marcus's idea. Marcus shrinks back, ready to hide, but Sarah steps forward with her hands on her hips, showing absolutely no respect for the eldest brother. She snaps that this is their private business, and Jacob has no right to interfere. She then turns to Leo, reminding him that he was the one who said they should separate after the wedding. Facing his uncle's pained gaze, Leo nods firmly and confirms that he wants out. He tells them that if they don't separate now, he and his siblings will be worked to death. This statement finally tears away the family's facade of harmony. In his past life, the lack of money led to his brother Toby being permanently disabled and Lucas dying of cancer without ever finding a wife. All the hard-earned money the brothers made was kept in a death grip by that poisonous woman. Hearing Leo's unwavering answer, Uncle Jacob lets out a long sigh and agrees to the split. Within moments, the uncle takes charge. He quickly summons the other uncles and the village officials. He demands to know if Marcus really intends to abandon his own flesh and blood. To everyone's shock, Sarah has the audacity to play the victim, claiming that Leo's wedding has emptied their coffers. This lie causes the hot-tempered Uncle Mike to slam his hand on the table. He shouts that Leo earned the dowry money himself through backbreaking labor, and the uncles provided the rest. He points out that Sarah hasn't contributed a single thing to the family. Having her lies exposed in public, Sarah throws herself onto the ground, wailing and throwing a tantrum about how she's being bullied. Finally, Uncle Jacob lets out a roar for her to be quiet. Uncle Jacob, his face dark with fury, finally lays down the law. He points out that Leo has been worked like an ox since he was 14, and Lucas is now earning full work points too. He demands $200 immediately to help them set up their own home. Not only that, but the uncle makes a decisive move right then and there. He declares that the 2 rooms in the East Wing will be transferred to Leo, and he orders the village chief to finalize the brothers' housing land right away. Then, he insists that the family grain must be split fairly per person. Hearing that money and food are on the line, Sarah reacts like a cat whose tail has been stepped on. She screams and jumps up, shouting that Jacob can give away whatever rooms he wants, but he won't touch her money or grain unless she dies right here today. However, Jacob doesn't even spare her a glance. Instead, he turns a cold, piercing gaze toward his younger brother, Marcus, who is currently pretending to be invisible. He stares down my cowardly father, Marcus, demanding to know what he intends to do about this. Marcus is so terrified he pulls his neck back like a turtle, unable to utter a single word. That is when Jacob lets out a cold laugh and plays his trump card. Being a man of the world, he decides to give these 2 a quick lesson in the law. He explains exactly how the current regulations work, leaving no room for their ignorance. From the smallest bowls and basins to the farm tools, Jacob meticulously divides everything into 2 shares. Leo watches all of this, a chill running through his heart. He realizes with a start that in his previous life, things went very differently simply because he wasn't there to stand his ground. Back then, that poisonous woman took advantage of Jacob's absence to kick the siblings out with absolutely nothing to their names. Later, Jacob was so enraged he slapped Marcus twice and never stepped foot in the family home again. In this life, Leo is determined that such a tragedy will never happen again. At that moment, Jacob looks at Leo with pity and asks if he has any other requests. Leo doesn't hesitate. Since they are settling the split today, he insists that the matter of his father's support in old age must be written down in black and white. In his past life, even after being kicked out, he was still treated like a slave by them. Back then, if he didn't give them money, they would ruin his reputation by calling him unfilial. To be honest, he's had enough of that. After a heated back and forth, it is finally settled. Once Marcus turns 60, Leo and Lucas will provide only 30 pounds of grain and $25 a year. Not a penny more. The father and son then press their thumbprints onto the separation agreement and the support contract. However, just as Jacob is forcing Sarah to hand over the $200 for the brothers' relocation, the woman suddenly pulls a dramatic move. Her eyes roll back, and she collapses straight onto the ground. She is clearly faking a faint to avoid paying. Jacob grits his teeth in frustration, but he can't risk the bad reputation of bullying his sister-in-law to death, so that money effectively vanishes into thin air. And just like that, what was supposed to be a joyous wedding banquet has turned into a complete farce. The relatives sigh as they carry away the borrowed tables and chairs, leaving the courtyard hauntingly quiet. Jacob looks at the siblings, his eyes red with emotion as he tells them to live well. But Leo isn't planning on just scraping by. He suddenly looks up and, lowering his voice, proposes a startling plan. He knows Jacob is the logistics chief at the city steel mill, holding the power over cafeteria procurement. In this era of state-controlled supplies, being a procurement chief is a stressful, thankless job. But in Leo's eyes, this position is nothing less than a money-printing machine that could change their destiny. He tells his uncle plainly that their village is surrounded by mountains and water. If they can get the resources out of the wilderness, it would solve the steel mill's urgent shortages. Jacob's face turns as white as paper upon hearing this. To be perfectly honest, the risks involved in such a suggestion are immense. After all, everything in the water belongs to the collective, and stealing even one fish could land a person in serious trouble. But Leo doesn't blink. He points to 15-year-old Lucas and the younger siblings huddled on the broken bed, asking how they could ever afford a house just by earning meager work points in the fields. Jacob stares at him, knowing this is the harsh reality. Finally, he lets out a long sigh and says he needs to think about it. It's a massive risk, but deep down, his heart aches for his nephews and nieces. Now that a path to survival is visible, it's time to settle the score with the Miller family. Lucas is so angry his eyes are bloodshot, his fists clenched as he prepares to go break the legs of the man Chloe ran off with. Leo stops him with a cold smile, remarking that forced fruit is never sweet. If that woman wants to leave, let her. But the $400 in dowry money the Millers swallowed? They're going to spit every single cent of it back out. In this day and age, that sum represents Leo's blood, sweat, and tears, money he earned through backbreaking labor and by going into debt. Jacob nods solemnly, deciding right then to accompany Leo to the Miller household to demand what is owed. Before leaving, Jacob looks at the drafty, dilapidated wing of the house, and then at his own brother, who is too cowardly to even speak. His eyes are full of sorrow and disappointment. But Leo stands tall. Even with such a terrible hand dealt to him at the start of this new life, he is determined to carve out a path for his siblings. Little Toby, weak with hunger, leans against Leo's leg, his voice sounding like a tiny, frail kitten. Today was supposed to be a wedding day, but for Leo, it has become the first day of a very different kind of battle. And so, our story truly begins. It was supposed to be a joyous wedding day, but we learn that Leo's little sister, Toby, had only a single sip of sugary water all morning just to save room for the feast. Feeling a pang of sorrow, Leo pulls out his last few cents and asks his eldest sister, Sophie, to run to the store for some soy sauce. Just then, Uncle Jacob stops Sophie in her tracks, grandly pressing a crisp, new $10 bill into her hand and telling her to buy the finest pastries available. After that, Leo picks up the 2 pounds of pork left by the relatives and begins slicing it up. He decides that even if the heavens fall today, he is going to make sure his starving siblings finally have a full meal. Suddenly, a sharp cry from little Toby rings out from the courtyard. Leo rushes out and finds Sarah's 2 lazy, greedy daughters violently wrestling with his sisters. They are trying to snatch the pastries away, and we see a bright red scratch on Toby's thin little arm. In his past life, these 2 cruel girls bullied his sisters constantly, but Leo isn't about to let that happen again. He shields his sisters and begins shouting toward the main house. At that moment, Sarah rushes out like a madwoman, screaming at Leo not to lay a finger on her daughters. To be honest, she should have stayed inside. Before she can even finish her sentence, Leo delivers a thunderous slap that sends the eldest daughter, Lily, spinning halfway around in place. I'll do more than touch them, Leo sneers, shaking his numbing palm while Sarah stands there in complete shock. A second later, she lets out an ear-piercing shriek and lunges at him with her claws out, but Leo is ready. He steps aside with perfect timing, and the toxic woman slams face first into the hard wooden door, her body dangling awkwardly halfway out. She begins wailing for her husband, Marcus, who is still hiding inside. But our cowardly father is so terrified of Jacob's authority that he doesn't even dare to show his face. Feeling a sense of grim satisfaction, Leo leads his siblings back inside to stew the meat. Soon, the rich aroma of pork fills the air, making the bruised Lily salivate with greed, only for the enraged Sarah to slap her back into her room. Watching Toby eat the fatty meat with grease on her chin, Leo feels a lump in his throat. In the 1970s, an era where even cornmeal was scarce, this is the first time his poor sister has ever eaten her fill of meat. He places a large piece of pork into Sophie's bowl, vowing silently that as long as he makes money, they will eat like this every day. Sitting nearby, Jacob pauses with his chopsticks. Seeing the bond between these siblings, he finally decides to help Leo navigate that dangerous path to wealth. But just as they finish their meal and prepare to settle the score with the Miller family, a young man from the Miller clan comes running to their door. Gasping for breath, he delivers a startling update. Leo's runaway bride, Chloe, has been caught and tied up by her own father. Leo sees through the situation instantly. In his previous life, the man she ran off with had his legs broken, and Leo was foolish enough to go through with the marriage anyway. This time, however, he has no intention of entering such a disgusting arrangement. On what was meant to be a wedding day, having the bride run off with another man is like dragging the entire Lee family's reputation through the mud. Jacob is absolutely livid. He sends the messenger away and immediately tells his son, Ryan, to gather the men. Soon, uncles, cousins, and the village elders are all called together, armed and ready. They must go to the Miller house to demand an explanation, or the Lee men will never be able to hold their heads up again. Ignoring Sarah's bitter cursing from the main house, Leo tells his sisters to lock the door and joins the group. By the time the Lee men reach the Miller residence, a massive crowd of villagers has already gathered to watch the drama unfold. In this conservative era, a bride running away is the kind of scandal people will talk about for a century. Even people from neighboring villages have traveled through the night to see the show. Jacob stands at the front of the crowd, his expression so cold it's frightening. The village chief, Mike, wipes cold sweat from his brow as he approaches, clearly terrified that someone might actually get killed today. To be perfectly honest, the tension in the air is thick enough to cut with a knife. However, Jacob simply stares at the Miller's tightly closed door and declares they are here for reason, not for blood. Suddenly, every eye in the crowd turns toward Leo. Don't worry, I'll see justice done for you, Jacob says, placing a heavy, supportive hand on Leo's shoulder. Just then, his other uncles and a group of cousins march forward, looking like they're ready for war. His cousin, Mark, is clutching a wooden club as thick as his arm, shouting that he'll tear the roof off the Miller house if Leo gives the word. Leo has always been fond of this hot-headed cousin, but Jacob's face darkens as he sternly orders the boy to hand over the club. Jacob is a man of the world. He knows that if they actually beat the Millers, Leo will be the one the village turns against later. At that moment, the local production captain arrives, panting as he pushes through the crowd. He insists that all village officials must be present to settle this messy account once and for all. Let's talk inside, he says, as Chloe's father, David, stands there with his face flushed red with shame. The man didn't even dare to raise his head. However, Uncle Jacob wasn't about to show him any mercy, coldly sneering that he wouldn't even step foot into such a house. It was a ruthless move. By refusing to take this scandal into the streets with drums beating, Jacob was already being incredibly generous. David's face turned a deep, bruised purple. He immediately gestured for his men to drag that shameful creature out. A second later, a disheveled figure was hauled through the gates, tied up like a bundle of firewood, her cheeks swollen like steamed buns. And yet, we recognize her instantly. This is the woman who made Leo's past life a living hell. This was his fiancée, Chloe. Remembering her cold, unfeeling heart from his previous life, Leo felt no emotion at all. He simply wanted to kick this harbinger of bad luck as far away as possible. I've brought her back, David growled through gritted teeth, pretending to be a man of integrity. It was the same old act. In his past life, David used this bitter sacrifice routine to trap Leo, forcing him to marry Chloe out of pity. But this time, Uncle Jacob wasn't buying it. He saw right through the performance and didn't hesitate to call out the man's hypocrisy. He spoke plainly, tearing away the Miller family's mask of respectability right in front of the entire village. Every member of the Miller clan stood there, their necks flushing red with embarrassment. David had foolishly hoped the marriage could still happen until Uncle Mike stepped forward. Pointing a finger directly at David's nose, Mike began shouting, asking who could possibly know if his daughter was still decent after running off with a man for a whole day. The villagers perched on the walls burst into a deafening roar of laughter at the suggestion. I'll kill you, Chloe's mother screamed, charging out of the house like a madwoman to throw herself at Mike. To her surprise, David grabbed her, spinning her around and delivering a heavy slap to her back that sent her scurrying back inside. Deep down, he was terrified. He knew that if Jacob gave the word, the hundreds of strong men in the Lee family could level his house in an instant. David tried to swear an oath regarding his daughter's purity, but it only invited more piercing mockery from the crowd. Finally, Jacob decided he was done wasting his breath. He unilaterally declared the engagement void and turned the floor over to Leo. Leo looked down coldly at Chloe, who was slumped on the ground. "If you really didn't want to be with me, you should have said so sooner," he said, finally venting the bitterness he had carried for a lifetime. She hadn't spoken up during the engagement or when the dowry was paid. Even a simple message the night before would have sufficed, as Leo wasn't the type to cling. Instead, she chose the wedding day to drag his reputation through the dirt. Chloe sat there, too guilty to even make a sound. Leo publicly announced he would let her go, wishing only that she wouldn't regret it later. "No way," David suddenly shrieked, jumping to his feet. He had planned on using Leo as a meal ticket for his old age and wasn't about to let such a prize escape. He sprinted to the woodshed and returned, clutching a thick vine which he tried to force into Leo's hand, demanding he beat the girl himself. Leo simply sneered and stepped aside. Frustrated, David prepared to kick her himself, but Jacob caught his arm with an iron grip, warning him to take his family business behind closed doors. Just as Jacob finished speaking, a commotion erupted outside the gate as several uninvited guests forced their way into the courtyard. A familiar figure brushed past Leo, rushing forward to pull Chloe into a protective embrace. It was Peter, even if he turned to ash. Leo would recognize that ugly face that had stepped on him in his past life. Surprisingly, the despair in Chloe's eyes vanished the moment she saw him, replaced by a sudden spark of hope. Seeing Leo still standing there, David began cursing Peter, desperate to save the marriage alliance. He ordered the Miller nephews to grab their tools and beat Peter to death. However, a middle-aged man who arrived with Peter rushed forward to intervene. Seeing the chaos, Jacob raised his hand, ordering the Lee men to keep the two sides apart. Jacob made it clear they didn't care about the Millers' messy affairs, but the financial debt between the families had to be settled. He didn't waste words, having his brother pull out the dowry list and slap it down in front of David. Knowing he was in the wrong, David didn't dare utter a word. Jacob took a hard stance, demanding the immediate return of the $400 in dowry money. This money was the lifeline Leo needed to take care of his siblings, and Jacob wouldn't let them cheat him out of a single cent. Just then, David looked over and saw Chloe and Peter holding each other tightly. His face turned purple with rage as he swung the vine with lethal intent. Unexpectedly, Chloe pushed Peter aside and took the blow herself. Then, she turned toward Leo with a pitiful, pleading look. "Leo, I'm begging you, just let me go, okay? I never loved you." As soon as she said it, the surrounding villagers were incensed, pointing and cursing her for her shamelessness. Hearing this woman play the victim after everything she had done, Leo couldn't help but laugh out loud. He asked her if he had ever forced her into this marriage at knife point. Suppressing the rage accumulated from a lifetime of her torment, he stripped away her hypocritical mask. The marriage was dead, but he was going to make sure they paid back every cent. "If you want back what's yours, I'll give it to you," Peter suddenly blurted out, acting like a big shot. Leo didn't say a word, simply holding out his hand, only for the man to stammer that he didn't actually have the cash. He had the nerve to suggest writing a promissory note instead, which prompted a deafening roar of laughter from the villagers. Red-faced with shame, Peter pointed a finger at Leo, warning him to be a man and stop making things hard for Chloe. The next second, Leo swung his arm and delivered a thunderous slap right across the man's face. He had reached his limit with this nonsense. The blow sent Peter crashing to the ground, while Chloe rushed over to comfort him with tearful eyes. Leo ignored their little drama, shouting that if the dowry wasn't returned immediately, he'd report the whole family for fraud. David finally lost his nerve. Knowing he couldn't hide the scandal of his daughter's double-dealing, he retreated inside to grab a stack of crumpled bills. As it turned out, he was still $35 short. He had to swallow his pride and beg his relatives to chip in until he finally scraped together the full $400. David assumed that paying the money would finally settle the score and end the nightmare. However, after Uncle Jacob finished counting the cash, he let out a chilling sneer that made everyone's skin crawl. "Settled?" he asked. The Lee family's reputation had been dragged through the mud, and the money spent on the wedding feast still hadn't been accounted for. The surrounding villagers were equally incensed, cursing the Miller family for their lack of morals. When Uncle Mike demanded an additional $300 to cover the costs of the ruined banquet, David's face turned the color of raw liver. David's face was a mask of pure agony as he realized his wallet was about to take another massive hit. He looked as though he'd been physically beaten. When he heard the final price of his daughter's mistakes, David nearly jumped out of his skin with rage. Peter's family lived in a drafty, broken-down shack without a single piece of decent furniture. This was hardly a good match, but the scandal of Chloe running off on her wedding day had already spread for miles. No respectable family would take her now. Peter's father, a cunning old fox named Silas, knew the Millers were backed into a corner. Silas would only offer $200 for the new marriage alliance. Chloe's mother exploded, screaming that they wouldn't let him take her for a cent less than $600. When Chloe tried to plead for her lover, her mother silenced her with a sharp slap to the face. After a long, performative haggling session, Silas managed to lock the dowry at $200 and even restricted the wedding guests to just 2 tables. Desperate to get rid of the shameful burden his daughter had become, David could only grit his teeth and accept. He forced Peter to sign a formal guarantee of support on the spot. In the blink of an eye, the 2 families settled their business, and Peter's kin left satisfied. Once they were alone, David sat by the stove, fuming as he puffed on his pipe. He pointed at Chloe, cursing her for dragging their ancestors' names through the dirt. To his shock, Chloe showed no remorse, stubbornly arguing that she'd rather go begging with Peter than stay. She even looked her father in the eye and made a bold claim. She hissed that even jumping into a fire pit would be 100 times better than being with Leo. Facing this ungrateful girl, David shook with rage, finally pointing to the door and swearing that if she died out there, she should never come crawling back. While the Miller house was in total chaos, Leo felt a sense of profound relief. He had his money back and had even secured some high-quality timber. Now, our reborn groom needed to carefully plan the second half of his life to ensure he'd never be stepped on again. Late that night, Uncle Jacob stepped over the threshold, his eyes full of concern as he told Leo to keep his chin up. He reminded the young man that he was a pillar of the family and shouldn't let a woman like Chloe ruin his spirit. Leo quickly poured him some tea. He told his uncle not to worry and brought up the favor he had asked for earlier. Jacob's expression grew solemn. In his position, one wrong move could implicate the whole family. Ultimately, he promised to go back and think it over very carefully. At dawn, the village loudspeaker began to blare. Listening to the familiar old melodies of that era, Leo washed his face, finally certain that his rebirth was real. Even though his stepmother, Sarah, was already in the next room throwing a tantrum, he treated it like the barking of a stray dog. He wouldn't suffer like before. After enduring the ultimate humiliation of a runaway bride, he was determined to pull his siblings up and give them a better life. Just then, as Uncle Jacob was preparing to head back to the city, he pulled Leo aside and, without a moment's hesitation, handed him a package. The dowry money he'd just recovered, along with every cent and grain ration coupon Jacob had, was suddenly thrust into Leo's pockets. Leo tried to refuse, knowing his uncle supported a paralyzed mother-in-law and 6 children. But Jacob gripped his hand firmly, urging him to pay off his debts and watch out for his foolish stepmother. Leo clutched the small fortune, realizing that in these changing times, he had to push himself to finally rise up. After that, he took his younger brother straight to the village square. The local women swarmed them immediately, but they weren't there to mock him. Instead, they loudly cursed the Miller family for being blind, arrogant fools. And this is where the situation took a rather sharp turn. Chloe actually believed that running off with a lowlife like Marcus was choosing love. Having lived through this once before, Leo knew exactly how miserable Marcus's life would end up. This time, Leo would be the one rising to the top. He looked forward to seeing the regret on Chloe's face one day. Just then, the village captain, Kevin, called Leo's name. To help him avoid the Miller's drama, Kevin assigned him to drive a wagon to the commune for supplies. Leo didn't hesitate. He hitched the wagon and went to see the village secretary. The man was surprisingly efficient, officially marking out a new housing plot for Leo and his brother, far away from their old family home. With the paperwork settled, Leo and Kevin drove the horse-drawn wagon 20 miles over rugged mountain terrain. By noon, they had reached the supply depot and filled 2 large drums with diesel, ready for a quick break. Suddenly, Kevin's expression soured as he announced they had to pick up several city youths who were arriving for rural service. Kevin rolled his eyes, muttering that these city kids were usually more trouble than they were worth. Soon, 3 large trucks roared into the courtyard, filled with dozens of youths singing patriotic songs about the vast countryside. Kevin leaned against the wagon with a sneer, knowing their enthusiasm would vanish the moment they touched a sickle. Leo watched those young, naive faces with a cold smile, certain they'd be running back to the city within a week. Kevin then pulled him into the state-run canteen, where they were served 4 white buns and a steaming bowl of stew. The food was delicious, but Leo froze after the first bite, thinking of his siblings at home eating coarse grains. Kevin saw right through him and immediately ordered 6 more buns to be wrapped up for the boy to take home. Leo tried to decline, but Kevin forced the warm paper parcel into his arms, telling him to give them to his younger brothers. Feeling a lump in his throat, Leo vowed he wouldn't stop until he had secured his first real fortune. After finishing their meal, they returned to the courtyard for the roll call. When the name Luna was called, Leo felt a jolt of recognition. He looked over and saw a gentle-looking girl in oversized blue overalls standing in the crowd. In his past life, she was the only one of the 13 city girls who actually married a local, specifically Leo's most unreliable cousin. She had endured decades in the village before finally returning to the city in the late 80s. Before he could dive deeper into his memories, Kevin shouted for him to help with the luggage. Leo stepped forward and grabbed a massive bedding roll, only for a loud, arrogant male voice to snap at him to be careful. Leo froze, staring at the punchable face of Jason, a man who, in his previous life, had publicly humiliated Leo's grandfather. Back then, Leo and his brothers had ambushed Jason in the middle of the night to teach him a lesson. Seeing his old enemy again, Leo's eyes flashed with a dangerous light. He slammed the heavy luggage down right onto Jason's feet. The murderous look in Leo's eyes made Jason swallow his insults and tremble in silence. Ignoring the awkward tension, Leo turned to help the others. Luna was quick to assist, helping him load the wagon efficiently. However, the wagon was small. With the diesel drums and the mountain of luggage, there was only room for 3. Kevin didn't mince words, ordering the 3 girls onto the wagon while telling the 3 boys they'd have to walk the 20 miles back. The city boys were horrified, demanding to know why another wagon hadn't been sent for them. Watching their impotent rage, Leo felt as if he were looking at a group of fools. Kevin didn't hold back either, pointing right at their noses and barking that if they couldn't handle a short walk, they had no business talking about rural education. After his lecture, Kevin turned on his heel without a second thought, and Leo certainly wasn't going to waste his time staring at these parasites. Once the girls were settled, Leo gave the reins a sharp crack, and the horse let out a long neigh as the wagon began to roll. As for the 3 boys, they could walk or starve in the county seat for all he cared. As the wagon pulled further away, Jason and his friends realized they had no one to complain to. With no other choice, they were forced to follow behind, gritting their teeth and swallowing dust. About 3 miles out, however, Luna suddenly spoke up in a soft voice, insisting on swapping places with the boys. Leo glanced back and saw that the 3 city masters were already staggering with exhaustion. They looked ready to collapse at any moment. To be honest, Luna was far too kind-hearted, but since she was determined to be a martyr, Leo saw no reason to stop her. He gave the whip a light flick, signaling the horse to stop by the roadside to wait for Jason and the others to pantingly catch up. Luna hopped down immediately, and the other 2 girls, seeing her lead, reluctantly gave up their seats as well. By the time they finished navigating the mountain passes and returned to the village, the sky was pitch black. The village secretary, Marcus, gave a brief, formal welcome before grudgingly sending the accountant to open the granary. Each youth was issued 100 pounds of raw grain, their entire livelihood until the end of the year. While the girls seemed resigned to the meager rations, Jason and the boys looked absolutely sickly at the sight of it. As soon as the grain was loaded onto the wagon, Jason had the nerve to try and climb back on. Leo didn't say a word. He simply blocked the way with his whip, his eyes cold and unwavering. He told Jason to get down and walk. Deep down, Leo's disgust was overflowing, remembering how this man had once laid violent hands on an elderly villager in his past life. He had no intention of coddling a beast like this. Jason trembled, his anger suppressed by pure fear as he pulled his hand back. Marcus started to protest the harsh treatment, but Kevin pulled him aside and whispered a few words, leading the secretary to suddenly decide he hadn't seen a thing. Leo then drove the wagon toward the youth dormitory at the foot of the mountain. Passing his uncle's house, his aunt, Sarah, called out warmly for him to come in for dinner. She had always been a kind soul, especially to Leo's younger siblings, so he simply waved her off and tossed his bag, filled with those white buns, right into her arms. He told her to let the kids eat and then send them home, knowing full well that no one had extra food to spare these days. Seeing a whole bag of precious white flour buns, Sarah tried to chase after him, but Leo gave the horse a quick snap of the reins and vanished into the night. Moments later, the wagon came to a halt. They arrived at the dormitory where the team leader, Silas, hurried out to offer Leo a cigarette with a flattering smile. Leo took the smoke but dropped the bombshell that 6 more youths had arrived. The news left Silas completely stunned. The dilapidated courtyard was already cramped enough with 13 people. Adding 6 more seemed like an impossible task, especially since the food supplies were already stretched to the breaking point. Leo, however, wasn't interested in their housing drama. He dumped the luggage, jumped back onto the wagon, and headed back to the village office to finish his shift. After settling the horse, he walked home through the darkness. But the moment he stepped through his own gate, his stepsister, Sophie, let out a scream as if she'd seen a ghost, yelling for her mother that he was back. The sound made Leo's blood boil instantly. He stormed into the yard and noticed a suspicious light flickering in the side wing. Suddenly, the door swung open and his stepmother, Chloe, practically ran into him, looking like a thief caught in the act. Normally, she would have started a screaming match, but under Leo's gaze, she suddenly lost her nerve. Her eyes darted around as she stammered a lie about just checking the room since no one was home. Leo felt a cold sneer forming in his heart. This woman would sooner see him and his siblings dead than look after them. He roughly shoved her back into the room and used the light to see what she'd been up to. His anger flared when he saw the cabinets flung wide open and clothes scattered everywhere. Even the bed mats had been torn up. It looked as though a pack of thieves had ransacked the place. Gritting his teeth, he stepped toward Chloe, who realized her search had been exposed. She tried to play dumb and slip away, but Leo grabbed her collar with a grip of iron, his eyes murderous. He asked her if she'd failed to find what she was looking for, offering with terrifying calm to help her search. Chloe turned pale, her eyes full of malice even as she shook with fear. Leo ignored her hateful glare and looked toward the trembling Sophie outside, leaning in to whisper a devastating secret into his stepmother's ear. He told her that even if she didn't care about her daughters, she should at least care about the child currently in her womb. The words hit Chloe like a thunderbolt, and she stumbled back, instinctively shielding her stomach while gasping out a question of how he could possibly know. Leo knew that by next year, she was destined to give his father a son, but he didn't give her a moment to breathe, warning her never to lay a hand on his sister again. Leo warned her that if his sister suffered even a slight grievance, the child in her womb wouldn't stand a chance. In these harsh times, miscarriages from field work were tragically common, and having lived one life already, he had nothing left to fear. He looked her in the eye and told her plainly, if anyone touched his family, he would take their life. He patted his chest, making it clear all the money was on him, and she wouldn't touch a single cent. This finally broke Chloe's nerve. She fled back to the main house in a panic, where the muffled sounds of her screaming at her own daughters soon followed. Leo listened to the commotion for a moment before turning back to the room. We see him survey the wreckage of his home with a cold, distant gaze. Just as he lit a small lamp to begin cleaning the mess, his younger brother, Marcus, burst in with their two sisters. Seeing the room looking as though it had been ransacked by bandits, Marcus's eyes turned red with fury, immediately blaming that woman. He let out a roar and grabbed a door bolt, ready to settle the score with Chloe right then and there. Leo lunged forward, grabbing the hot-headed boy and holding him back with an iron grip. If he let Marcus go, someone wasn't surviving the night. He whispered that he had already warned her, and after seeing his resolve, she wouldn't dare return. Marcus gritted his teeth, reluctantly stopping in his tracks before asking what on earth Chloe had been looking for. Leo let out a cold sneer, explaining it was for the dowry money. The woman had clearly been listening to village gossip and sent her daughter to keep watch while she tried to rob them. Hearing this, Marcus and little Sarah turned pale with shock. It wasn't until Leo patted his chest and promised the money was hidden on his person that the two children finally let out a long sigh of relief. Deep down, however, Leo knew Chloe wouldn't give up that easily. She was likely already plotting something else. He knew she would eventually goad his father, Silas, into coming over to cause trouble. Living in the same courtyard with these leeches was becoming utterly suffocating, and the idea of building a new house began to grow wildly in his mind. After paying off the village debts today, he still had $35 left in his pocket. If he just wanted a few simple mud brick rooms, that would be more than enough. But having spent his previous life living in broken caves where dirt fell from the ceiling and rats ran rampant, he wanted better. There was a brick kiln in town, and getting a permit through his uncle would be easy enough. However, reality soon hit him hard. Building 3 proper red brick rooms would require at least 30,000 bricks. At 7 cents a brick, that totaled over $2,000, a staggering fortune he simply didn't have. As he sat there with his brow furrowed in worry, little Sophie suddenly tugged timidly at his sleeve, asking when they could eat meat again. Looking into his sister's longing eyes, Leo felt as if a needle had been driven into his heart. Before he could answer, Sarah gave Sophie a sharp smack on the back, scolding her and telling her to go to sleep. It was a harsh reaction, but in this era, every child was starving for a taste of meat. Sophie began to cry silent, aggrieved tears. Leo had sworn just yesterday to give his siblings a better life, and if he couldn't even provide a single meal of meat, what kind of man was he? He told her firmly that he would get them meat tomorrow, speaking with a finality that brooked no argument. In the middle of the night, Leo quietly rolled off the bed. Marcus, sleeping beside him, woke instantly, but Leo whispered for him to stay put. He turned to a pile of junk in the corner and pulled out 2 heavy steel traps, precious survival tools his grandfather had risked everything to hide during the Great Leap Forward. Marcus's eyes lit up at the sight, and he moved to follow Leo up the mountain. Leo firmly pressed him back onto the bed, ordering him to stay and protect their sisters. He told him to bolt the door and open it for no one. He had heard his father return earlier and knew the man was in a foul mood. Chloe was already nagging Silas about the money from the railway work, and Leo had to ensure the man didn't do anything reckless in the night. Once settled, Leo grabbed a hoe and a machete, slipping over the wall to avoid being seen. Under the pale, cold moonlight, he began his trek east toward the Great Mountains. Years ago, the entire village had fought a bloody battle with 3 other towns just to claim this mountain for themselves. It was a place of life and death, and Leo knew every hidden path by heart. He climbed steadily upward, moving through the shadows like a ghost returning to familiar haunts. Large game had long since been hunted to extinction in these parts, so he was pinning his hopes on these 2 old traps to catch a few stray rabbits. He found an old pit trap he had dug years ago, but as expected, it was empty. He quickly reset the camouflage and buried the steel trap, marking the spot carefully. He then moved deeper into the mountain hollow where 2 old apricot trees grew. He scrambled up the branches and managed to gather about a dozen pounds of wild apricots that had been missed by others. Even if he didn't catch any meat tonight, at least Sophie would have something sweet to snack on. But as he prepared to climb down, the unexpected happened. From the nearby thicket, a bone-chilling rustling and grunting sound erupted. By the light of the moon, he watched in horror as the shadows of the trees began to shake violently, accompanied by the heavy sound of bark being rubbed raw. A wild boar. The realization hit him like an explosion. He remembered hunting with his uncle and knew just how destructive these beasts were when they were marking their territory. A wild boar's aggression could rival a tiger's, and they often traveled in groups. A second later, two dark shapes, built like small tanks, charged out from the depths of the forest. As he watched from the tree, Leo felt his breath catch in his throat. The lead boar had to weigh at least 200 pounds, and its pale, wicked tusks were long enough to disembowel a man with a single upward thrust. To be honest, this was far more meat than he had bargained for. Leo froze, one leg already midair, as he scrambled back to the highest branches of the tree. He clung to the trunk, not daring to breathe. While cold sweat poured down his forehead, he knew that if he were discovered, there wouldn't even be a bone left of him. Fortunately, the two beasts were only passing through for water, and after lingering beneath the tree for a moment, they vanished back into the deep forest. Only when the silence was absolute did Leo finally dare to exhale, leaning his forehead against the rough bark in sheer relief. Once those plague gods were far enough away, he slid down the trunk, wishing he had a machine gun from the village office to wipe them out then and there. He didn't want to stay in this haunted place a second longer. Wild boars were unervingly clever creatures. He feared they might double back, so he quickly retraced his steps, checking his traps one last time with a lingering hope. To his surprise, he actually found something that had blundered right into his snare, a stroke of luck he hadn't expected. A fat rabbit was stuck firmly in the trap, and Leo swiftly broke its neck, weighing it in his hand at a solid 4 pounds. He could finally keep his promise to little Sophie tomorrow. Even if the ruined pelt was useless, he stuffed the prize into his sack. Thinking this was the best he could hope for, he turned to head down the mountain, but at that moment, a bone-chilling cold surged up his spine. He didn't even have time to look back. His body acted on pure survival instinct. He lunged forward into a desperate roll through the mud just as a deafening crash shook the very air behind him. Looking up, he saw a massive boar covered in needle-like black bristles, which had just slammed into the tree where he had been standing. A cold sweat broke out as he realized the beast had actually tried to ambush him. If he hadn't moved, he'd be a cripple for the rest of his life. Having missed its mark, the beast shook its massive head and pivoted, preparing for a second deadly charge. At that critical moment, something almost comical happened. The charging boar took 2 steps and tumbled headfirst into the deep pit trap Leo had dug earlier. It was a stroke of fate that left him breathless. Well, he certainly couldn't be blamed for what happened next. Leo scrambled up, grabbed a stone the size of a millstone, and hurled it down at the screaming beast. One wasn't enough to settle the score, so he hauled up an even heavier rock and threw it with everything he had. After several heavy blows, the struggling sounds in the pit finally went silent, leaving Leo to collapse into the mud, gasping for air. He had only been reborn for a single day, and he had nearly lost his life on this godforsaken mountain. Once his breathing steadied, he saw that this boar wasn't one of the 2 he'd seen earlier. This one was a 400-pound monster with tusks that gleamed like cold steel. In an era where people were starving, this beast was unnaturally well fed. It was likely a lone wolf that had wandered away from its sounder, and to keep outsiders from spotting it, Leo quickly camouflaged the pit with thick branches. Forgetting the firewood, he shouldered his sack and ran down the mountain toward his Uncle Jacob's house. The midnight wind howled through the valley as he pounded on the door until his cousin, Mike, finally cracked it open with a sleepy look. Before Mike could shout a greeting, Leo grabbed his arm and pulled him back inside. The commotion woke Uncle Jacob and Aunt Sarah. Jacob stepped out in a tattered coat, his face turning pale at the sight of Leo's blood-stained machete and bulging sack. He began to scold Leo for being reckless, mentioning that someone had seen boar tracks on the mountain just that day. Leo didn't give him a chance to finish, simply telling his uncle to grab ropes and a carrying pole and follow him. He tossed the sack onto the stove, leaving Jacob staring in shock, demanding to know what on earth had happened. When Leo calmly mentioned a 400-pound boar was sitting in his pit, the words hit the room like a thunderclap. Jacob, a hunter for half his life who had never even touched a boar's bristle, stared with wide, disbelieving eyes as the rest of the family scrambled out of bed. The children's eyes practically glowed with excitement, and though Mike begged to go along, a sharp look from Jacob pinned him to the spot. The 3 men gathered their gear and slipped back up the mountain under the cold light of the moon. Seeing the massive creature dead in the pit, Jacob took a sharp breath and immediately checked Leo for injuries. Leo brushed it off, but his uncle sternly forbade him from ever hunting at night again, reminding him he had 3 siblings depending on him. The 3 of them then set to work, and Leo found that his reborn body possessed the strength of an ox as they hauled the beast up. However, getting this massive prize back to the village without being seen was going to be no easy task. Uncle Jacob stared at the beast with a worried frown. In these starving times, 400 pounds of meat was a fortune that could just as easily bring ruin as it could relief. Leo suggested they take it back, keep a portion for the family, and hand the rest to the village chief, a move that would secure both his reputation and a fair trade of grain. After they hauled the prize into the yard, Aunt Sarah fussed over Leo's minor scratches while his young cousins stared at the mountain of meat with wide, hungry eyes. The family spent the night boiling water and scraping bristles, their eyes red with exhaustion, but their hearts light at the prospect of a real feast. Leo expertly carved away 30 pounds of the prime cuts, firmly stating that this meat was for their two households only, and definitely not for his greedy stepmother, Clara. He knew Clara all too well. The moment any good resource touched her hands, she would secretly funnel it back to her own biological family, leaving her stepchildren to starve. While her own brother lived like a king, her stepchildren remained skin and bones. Leo told Jacob that only his father was invited to eat. Clara and her daughters were barred. Blood ties meant he had to show his father some respect, but he felt no such obligation toward the woman who had spent years mistreating him and his siblings. Uncle Jacob nodded in silent agreement as the room's attention remained fixed on the marbled meat. As dawn approached, Leo prepared to head back out into the morning chill. He declined a sack of meat for himself, telling them to cook the rabbit for the girls instead, and simply tucked a few wild herbs into his pocket before slipping away. His aunt and uncle watched him go, marveling at his newfound maturity, but Leo wasn't heading home. A sudden memory of a massive historical discovery spurred him back toward the peaks. He remembered a man named Marcus who had become incredibly wealthy overnight in his past life, rumored to have found a jar of gold near an ancient mountain tomb. To change his siblings' lives, Leo knew he couldn't wait for luck. He wasn't looking to rob a grave, but he remembered reports of a hidden cache nearby. He carried his hoe through the darkness, navigating by memory toward a ruined temple where the legendary treasure was said to have been first disturbed. The temple was a wreck, its statues smashed to dust, but 10 meters away lay an old stone pillar carved with weathered patterns, the exact marker the archaeologists had used. He gripped the edge of the heavy pillar, straining until his muscles burned, and finally heaved it aside before digging feverishly into the earth beneath. He dug over a meter deep, but as the sky began to pale and the village loudspeakers hummed to life, he found nothing but dirt, leaving him frustrated and doubting his memory. Then, his shovel struck something solid. He reached down and pulled out a heavy, mud-caked disc that shimmered with the unmistakable, eternal luster of pure gold. It was a gold biscuit, etched with ancient characters and weighing nearly 3 ounces. It was a fortune held in the palm of his trembling hand. Suppressing his racing heart, he forced himself to press the gold back into the soil and replace the stone pillar, knowing he had to be patient to keep this secret safe. Using a head of cabbage as a shield, Leo stepped into the yard only to see his father, Marcus, eating coldly. He glanced at Leo as if he were invisible, a level of parental indifference rarely seen. Leo ignored him and called toward the smoky side room for his brother, Toby, who rushed out with dark circles under his eyes to complain about Leo's late return before pointing inside to their sister. Their eldest sister, Clara, stepped over the threshold wearing a tattered apron. If not for her, the younger siblings would have perished long ago. She had waited until she was 24 to marry a factory worker, a man who turned out to be a spineless coward whose family tormented her. Leo felt a pang of heartache seeing her so frail, having given birth less than a month ago when he had married. That pathetic husband of hers hadn't even bothered to show his face to the family. With tearful eyes, Clara gripped Leo's hand, her voice trembling as she explained she had rushed 40 miles from town before dawn after hearing his engagement had fallen through. Leo quickly helped her inside. He worried about her leaving her newborn daughter behind with her wicked mother-in-law, a woman so obsessed with having a grandson that she had spent a month berating Clara for giving birth to a girl. He shuddered to think what those monsters would do now that Clara had fled. In his past life, Leo had eventually been forced to storm the factory with his brothers just to demand a written guarantee of her safety. Only after she bore a son did her life become bearable, yet she had still died far too young. Now, Clara gripped his hand tightly, demanding to know the truth about his broken engagement. Leo glanced at his 3 younger siblings and calmly explained that since the bride's family looked down on him, he wouldn't beg. This sent Clara into a frantic state of disbelief and frustration. She insisted that their uncles wouldn't stand for such bullying, notably leaving out any mention of their father, Marcus, whose selfish nature she knew all too well. Then, Leo decided to reveal the full truth. He explained that he had recovered the entire dowry and their uncle had even secured several high-quality timber beams for their future homes. Yet, Clara still wept for the public humiliation her brother faced. In a small village, being jilted so publicly usually meant being the target of endless gossip. But Leo didn't want to start a feud that would put the helpful village chief in a difficult position. Clara fell silent before vowing through her tears that they would live so well that the other family would turn green with envy. Then, her tone shifted as she asked why the household had been split. Young Toby jumped in, shouting that if they hadn't split the family, they would have remained slaves to their stepmother forever. Clara glared at him, but Leo stepped in to explain his decisive move. He told her it was better to cut ties than to be watched like a thief every day by their stepmother, Sarah, who had only agreed to the split because she coveted the main house's rooms. She had spent her life calculating how to drain every last drop of resources from the family. Clara let out a long, heavy sigh at the realization. She admitted it was for the best to stop being unpaid labor, but their heart-to-heart was interrupted by a crisp female voice at the gate as a pretty figure appeared at the door of the side room. Leo froze when he recognized the visitor as Maya. Clara reacted like a protective lioness, instantly standing up to block the doorway so Maya couldn't see inside. Maya was Leo's age and a distant relative he barely spoke to. Yet she leaned over Clara's shoulder, smiled directly at him, and asked to speak in private before running off as fast as a rabbit. She was a striking beauty, with a figure that rivaled any girl in the village, though her skin was a shade darker. As she swayed out of the yard, Clara slammed the door shut, her eyes filled with a sharp, sudden suspicion. It seemed Clara suspected Leo of having some secret, illicit affair with Maya, which would explain why his engagement fell through. Leo burst out laughing at the absurdity. He knew exactly why his sister was so terrified of that girl. You see, Maya's mother was infamous across the countryside, a woman whose reputation was so tarnished that local men practically lined up to meet her in the cornfields. An honest soul like Clara feared any association with such a family. While Leo didn't believe in judging children for the sins of their parents, he remembered Maya's future from his past life. She would eventually marry a relative, only to be caught in a scandalous affair that ended in a bloody divorce. After that, she had truly let herself go, following in her mother's footsteps and eventually surpassing her in notoriety. To put his sister's mind at ease, Leo solemnly promised he would never bring such a green hat of shame upon himself. Just then, their youngest sister, Lily, stumbled out rubbing her eyes and begging for meat. With a grand wave of his hand, Leo promised they would go to their uncle's house that night and eat until they were completely full. Clara, thinking he meant to spend his meager savings, frantically tried to press her own small wages into his hand. He quickly explained the wild boar trap and handed Lily a piece of wild fruit to distract Clara from the danger of his hunt. He changed the subject, urging everyone to eat before work, and gave his brother Toby a knowing look. Toby's eyes were already shining at the thought of pork, but Clara remained gripped by a deep, motherly worry for Leo's safety. Leo brushed off her concerns, only to find her preparing to return to her husband's home. Seeing her face, pale as paper before she had even finished her recovery month, he grew angry. Relying on her wicked mother-in-law was pure fantasy. He insisted she stay to recover her strength with the boar meat, declaring he would personally drive her back tomorrow while hauling winter supplies for the village. Without giving her a chance to argue, he grabbed a biscuit and pulled Toby outside. As they ran, Toby eagerly asked just how big the boar was, but Leo simply told him their uncle would deliver it to the village office soon. Toby stopped dead in his tracks, grumbling about why they weren't keeping it all for themselves. Leo turned to stare at his naive younger brother, reminding him that a 400-pound boar was far too much for one family. To eat such a prize in secret while the rest of the village watched with hungry, envious eyes was a recipe for disaster. Toby scratched his head, finally realizing the wisdom in his brother's words. Leo warned him that one must never try to claim every single advantage for oneself. But as they reached the threshing floor, a figure stepped out from behind a tree. It was Maya again. Remembering Clara's stern warning, Leo tried to give a polite nod and walk past, but the woman was determined, blocking his path and demanding to speak with him alone. With a sigh, he sent Toby ahead. Toby, however, wouldn't even look at her, his mind filled with Clara's warnings about the girl's mother. He was terrified Maya would ruin Leo's reputation, and he only moved along once Leo's expression turned truly stern. Once they were alone, Maya's facade shifted. She stared at Leo and asked with a trembling voice if his engagement was truly over. He nodded without hesitation, and in the next second, she bit her lip to hide a look of pure triumph. She looked up, her face flushing as she asked if he would be willing to marry her instead. Leo was stunned as memories of his past life flooded back. He knew her desperation didn't stem from love, but from a need to escape. Her mother's reputation had made Maya a pariah in the village, and she was dying to find a reliable man to help her flee the constant gossip. When she had heard Leo was marrying the village beauty, she had nearly burned with jealousy. Now that the other woman was gone, she saw Leo as her only lifeline. When he didn't answer immediately, the hope in her eyes curdled into a mix of bitter anger and desperation. She ground her teeth, her voice dripping with venom. She demanded to know if he looked down on her too, all because of her mother's scandalous past. In that moment, she looked like she wanted to tear her own mother apart, and Leo watched her, knowing the dark path she would eventually take. Maya finally lost her composure and lashed out with bitter words. Leo calmly told her it wasn't about anyone else. They simply weren't a match, but he never expected this casual remark to trigger such a frantic, tearful scene. She wouldn't let it go, demanding a better explanation. Meanwhile, more villagers were appearing on the road, stopping to point and whisper. Maya, always proud of her looks, found herself the center of a growing, mocking spectacle. As the crowd grew, she threw away all dignity, clinging to Leo and demanding to know exactly why she wasn't good enough. Just then, a group of city youths on a work program marched by, led by a self-important man named Arthur. Arthur began shouting, threatening to report them to the village director for moral misconduct. Even a new girl named Sophie gave Leo a judgmental look, and as the situation spiraled, Leo felt a flash of genuine anger. He raised his voice so everyone could hear, reminding Maya that her grandmother was his great-aunt, making them far too closely related to ever marry. While she stood there stunned, Leo seized the moment to slip away toward the threshing floor. He felt a cold sense of relief. He didn't care why she had fallen into ruin in his past life. He only wanted to stay far away from her now. As he entered the yard, Toby tried to gossip, but Leo quickly shut him down. Suddenly, the village loudspeaker crackled to life with a piercing screech. The village director, Jacob, spoke with a voice trembling with excitement, announcing to the entire village that Leo had single-handedly taken down a massive wild boar. The village erupted in a frenzy of whispers as every eye turned toward Leo. In these lean years when no one dared to provoke such a beast in the deep mountains, Leo had not only returned unharmed, but he had done something unthinkable. He had donated the entire 400-pound boar to the village. Jacob shouted that every household should send someone to the office at noon to claim their share of meat. Even a single pound was a miraculous gift in these times. Suddenly, Leo was the village hero, receiving thumbs up from everyone. Someone in the crowd loudly mocked Leo's former father-in-law, Marcus, for being blind to Leo's worth, and Marcus's face turned a deep, embarrassed shade of purple. Marcus looked like he wanted to vanish, while his daughter, who had run off with another man, stood there like a statue, likely still dreaming of her wealthy future. Meanwhile, in the back of the crowd, a pair of calculating eyes watched. Leo's stepmother, Sarah, began whispering poison into the ear of his biased father, Silas, successfully igniting his temper. After the work assignments were handed out, Leo and Toby grabbed their shovels, but they didn't get far. Silas rushed over with a darkened face, blocking Leo's path and demanding to know if Leo still respected him as a father. Leo shot back instantly, saying he knew exactly who his father was, unlike some people who couldn't even tell if their children were their own. Several men nearby couldn't help but burst out laughing at the hidden meaning. His pride wounded, Silas dragged Leo to a secluded corner and swung his arm to strike him, but Leo was faster. Leo caught his arm, staring into his father's eyes with a coldness born of 2 lifetimes. In his past life, this man's negligence had cost Leo's sister her leg. He warned Silas that while he cared about his public reputation, there was no telling what he might do in private. Terrified by Leo's murderous gaze, Silas pulled back, threatening to disown him. To his shock, Leo didn't hesitate, demanding they tear up their old support agreement right then and there and sign a formal document of separation. Silas was stunned. The old man relied on Leo and Toby for his future, and he didn't actually have the courage to cut ties. He quickly changed the subject, angrily demanding to know why Leo hadn't given him the boar meat first. Leo laughed coldly, pointing out that they lived in separate households now. He told Silas that if he wanted to act like a traditional father, he should be prepared to pay for the brothers' wedding costs and their sisters' dowries in full. The barrage of questions about money and responsibilities left Silas completely speechless and bewildered. Just then, Leo's uncles, Mike and John, walked over, and Silas turned to them like they were a lifeline. He began complaining loudly, accusing Leo of disregarding his own father by giving the boar to the village. However, Mike didn't even look at him, instead letting out a snort of pure disgust and asking why on earth Leo should respect him at all. Mike wasn't finished. He invited Leo for dinner and warned Silas that his toxic stepmother, Sarah, was strictly forbidden from coming. His other uncle, John, added with a grin that they'd already set aside a choice cut of meat for the boys, leaving Silas completely humiliated and shamelessly muttering to himself. He grumbled that the rest of the meat shouldn't have gone to the village, but the uncles simply ignored the old fool and led Leo toward the fields. Soon, our group arrived at the rice paddies, where a gentle breeze stirred a sea of golden stalks, filling the air with a rich, earthy fragrance. Leo took a deep breath, feeling a sudden, inexplicable sense of peace wash over him. In his past life, he had left for the city in his 30s to become a contractor, and it had been decades since he touched the soil. Yet, the moment he stepped into the field, something shifted. It seemed his long-dormant muscle memory had been instantly awakened. As he swung his shovel with lightning speed and precision, the neighboring villagers watched in awe, turning to scold their own clumsy sons. After all, Leo had been treated like a workhorse since he was 14. This kind of farm work was second nature to him, and in the blink of an eye, he had left everyone else far behind. Meanwhile, the city youth group was struggling nearby, especially Arthur, who had been looking for trouble earlier but was now so exhausted he could barely stand up straight. His hands were covered in painful blisters, and it was clear his grand ambitions of building a career in the countryside had vanished into thin air. Even more absurdly, he looked at Sophie, who was working hard beside him, and actually resented her for working too fast and making him look bad. Unbeknownst to him, the team leader, Ryan, and the record keeper had seen everything. Ryan gave a cold snort and told the record keeper to document Arthur's laziness in detail. He knew that when the grain was distributed at the end of the year based on work points, these arrogant city boys would learn the true meaning of hunger. By noon, Director Jacob and the village accountant arrived carrying a large basket filled with folded slips of paper. One person from each household was called forward to draw lots for a share of Leo's wild boar meat, and the field suddenly erupted with excitement and laughter. Those who drew meat were overjoyed, while those who got the offal began dreaming of a rich cabbage stew. Then, a truly ridiculous scene unfolded. Arthur shamelessly approached a senior city youth named Jake, his eyes gleaming as he asked when it would be their turn to draw lots. Jake stared at him as if he were a complete idiot, remaining silent until every last villager had finished. When Arthur realized no one was calling the city youths names, he actually had the nerve to publicly demand that the director explain why they were being excluded. The lively field fell into a deathly silence as every villager stared at this Sunday city boy like he was a circus clown. Facing this baseless interrogation, Jacob's expression turned incredibly dark, and he didn't hold back his irritation for even a second. He announced loudly that Leo had risked his life to bring this boar down, meaning it wasn't collective property at all. It was Leo's personal choice to share it with the villagers out of kindness, a statement that left Arthur completely speechless and red-faced. Still, the boy wouldn't give up, complaining to Jake that the village was bullying the city youths. Jake looked like he wanted to strangle him, snapping that this was Leo's village and he'd better drop the city arrogance and learn his place. Jake knew all too well that Arthur had just made a powerful enemy. From a distance, Leo watched Arthur's frustrated tantrum and felt a cold smile touch his lips. In his past life, this man's arrogance had eventually enraged the entire village. In this life, Leo decided that with just a little nudge, he would make sure Arthur suffered every single day. After the midday meal, just as Ryan called everyone back to work, Leo handed in his tools and prepared to leave. Arthur's eyes flared with rage, thinking he had finally caught Leo slacking off and intending to report him for avoiding labor. However, he bit his tongue at the last second, having finally learned a bit of caution. What he didn't realize was that the village operated on a quota system. Thanks to his incredible muscle memory, Leo had finished his entire day's task in a single morning, allowing his whole group to leave early. As Leo walked away, his younger brother Toby rushed to catch up, trying to use their older sister as an excuse to pressure him. Leo shot him a look so sharp and commanding that Toby instantly went quiet, and the two brothers headed straight for the back mountains to check their traps. They found the pits empty without a single boar hair in sight, leaving Toby looking utterly disappointed. He had no idea that Leo hadn't come up here to hunt, nor was he foolish enough to walk around the village carrying that jar of gold that would make anyone's eyes turn green with envy. Instead, Leo reached down and plucked a jagged weed from the mud, thrusting it into Toby's hand. This was Siberian ginseng. Having been forced to memorize medical texts by his grandfather, Leo knew the mountains were actually covered in valuable herbs that could be traded for real silver. In his previous life, the villagers only realized the staggering value of these weeds after city people came to scavenge them, stripping the mountain bare in a single summer. Leo looked Toby in the eye, ordering him to keep this a total secret, and then the two of them began their harvest. Leo dug with a frantic intensity, stopping only when the sky turned dark to carry his bulging sacks down the mountain. But as he reached the courtyard, the shrill, biting voice of his stepmother, Sarah, pierced the air as she berated his spineless father, Marcus. Marcus stood there with his head bowed in shame, but Leo simply let out a cold snort and strode into the yard. Seeing him, the toxic woman immediately flopped onto the ground, wailing about her hard life just as the neighbors began to gather around to watch the drama. Leo didn't hold back, pointing directly at her face and delivering a scathing lecture that left Sarah rolling on the ground in a fury, even kicking off her tattered shoes. Marcus, his face flushed with embarrassment, tried to use his authority as a father to force Leo to back down. Leo merely squinted at him with a mocking expression, asking if he really expected to take his two-step siblings along to feast on meat. The moment the words left his mouth, Sarah snapped upright like a wild dog scenting blood, her eyes gleaming with a greedy green light. She stood stiffly in the mud, and Leo inwardly sneered. He usually couldn't be bothered with her, but tonight, he planned to strike where it hurt. As night fell, the rich, heavy scent of roasting meat began to drift from every chimney in the village, and Leo headed toward his Uncle Mike's house. Inside, over 20 family members were staring hungrily at the large iron pot in the main room, and young Toby looked ready to dive headfirst into the soup. Then, Mike's wife lifted the lid, releasing a cloud of savory steam that filled every corner of the house. Little Timmy from the other uncle's family was drooling so much he'd soaked his shirt, but once Mike gave the word, glistening chunks of boar were ladled into every bowl. Toby immediately grabbed a piece of scalding fat with his bare hands, hopping around in pain but refusing to let go of the prize. Even as it burned, he kept chewing, while Uncle John carefully produced a rare bottle of white liquor gifted to him by a patient's family. Only the senior men and the eldest sons, Mike, John, Leo, and John's eldest, David, were permitted to sit at the table and drink tonight. Leo tilted his head back and took a swig of the harsh spirit, feeling the fiery sting burn its way down his throat and into his stomach. He followed it with a large mouthful of wild boar, the gamey, primal flavor hitting him all at once just as Uncle Mike set down his glass. Mike stared at Leo and sighed heavily, noting that Leo's cowardly father, Marcus, hadn't dared to show up after all. He knew that if Marcus dared to eat here without Sarah, he wouldn't even be allowed back on his own bed tonight. Leo, however, kept a cold expression. He curtly told his uncle not to mention the man again, and seeing the mood, Uncle John dropped a piece of fat into a child's bowl before turning to warn Leo. He told him that going up the mountain at night was far too dangerous, but Leo simply gave a vague nod to ease their worries. The family finished the meal with more fervor than a New Year's feast, and afterward, Mike pointed to 3 pounds of meat set aside on the counter. He told Leo to take it to the village director, Jacob. In his past life, Leo's pride would have made him refuse to bribe a relative. But now, Leo understood perfectly that nothing in this village happened without Jacob's nod, so he tucked the meat under his coat and headed south. He found Jacob in the yard repairing a stool, and the older man looked up with a friendly smile as Leo approached. Without wasting a single word, Leo thrust the oil paper package of meat into the arms of Jacob's wife, Elena. Feeling the soft weight of the gift, Elena tried to push it back in a panic, but Leo whispered for her to keep it quiet so the neighbors wouldn't get jealous. Elena looked at her husband in confusion, but Jacob simply waved his hand for her to accept it before offering Leo an unfiltered cigarette. Seizing the moment, Leo asked to borrow the village horse carriage tomorrow to fetch salt from the neighboring town of Ninggu. He added that he also wanted to drop his older sister off at her in-laws, and Jacob agreed instantly, without a moment's hesitation. With the deal struck, Leo turned to leave, keeping his grander plans hidden. He wasn't about to let a single word leak until the time was right. He would wait for tomorrow to reveal everything. But as he stepped back into his own yard, Sarah's screeching voice once again tore through the air. She was hiding in the main house, cursing the entire family line, until Leo suddenly snatched up a jagged piece of tile from the corner. He hurled it at the window with a deafening crash, and Sarah's cursing stopped instantly, making her sound like a chicken being strangled. Even his father, Marcus, stood frozen by the door in total disbelief as Leo stared at the dark window with narrowed eyes. He growled a warning that if she ever insulted his ancestors again, he wouldn't let her off easy, and for once, the woman didn't dare utter a peep. Leo then kicked open the door to the side room, where his sister, Clara, tried to plead with him to control his temper. He silenced her by mentioning the trip to town, but her face went pale when she spotted the 2 sacks of ginseng roots in the corner. She began to mutter in terror about whether he was engaging in a legal capitalist trade, and Leo couldn't help but let out a short laugh. To protect his secret leverage for a better life, Leo quickly spun a lie, claiming he'd heard on the radio that the state-run pharmacy was buying certain goods. He told his sister, Clara, that he was simply heading to the pharmacy to sell some herbs and settle a few matters. Leo didn't mind the trouble at all. He even pressed $2 into Clara's hand as a gift for her newborn son before snapping the whip to set the carriage in motion. But as they passed the village square, a figure suddenly dashed out like a madman directly into their path. In that split second, Leo yanked the reins with all his might, the horse's hooves skidding to a halt just inches from the person's face. It was Sophie, the young city girl, looking pale and breathless as she gasped out that she'd heard he was heading to the town of Ninggu. Leo looked at the flushed Sophie and asked what was wrong. Trembling, she pulled out an envelope and stammered a plea for him to help her mail a letter home. Of course, he replied, tucking the letter into his coat as Sophie bowed deeply in gratitude before running back to her group. With a crack of the whip, the journey continued, and before 10 o'clock, the carriage pulled up in front of his eldest sister's in-law's house. But as they arrived, they could already hear the shrill, grating voice of Clara's mother-in-law, a woman with sharp, unkind eyes, shouting at the gate. The old woman was loudly bragging to anyone who would listen that her second son was a formal factory worker and only married a country girl because of his short stature. It was a blatant attempt to humiliate Clara, but Leo simply sneered and let his horsewhip crack like a thunderclap in the air. The sharp sound forced the old woman to swallow her insults, and her fleshy face immediately twisted into a fake, strained smile. She made a half-hearted pretense of greeting them, though her backside remained firmly glued to her bench without moving an inch. Leo shot back with a look of pure disgust, telling her not to strain her old back on his account as he set the brake and helped Clara down. After unloading 2 heavy sacks of cabbage, his little niece, Lily, came flying out of the yard to wrap her arms around him. He patted her head affectionately and pulled a grease-stained paper package from his coat, causing Lily's eyes to light up as she shouted for meat. He tore open the paper to reveal nearly half a pound of fatty, succulent wild boar, a prize he had carefully hidden away from the previous night's feast. He had saved this specifically for his niece, but the moment the old woman saw the meat, her face wrinkled into a greedy grin like a blooming chrysanthemum. She reached out a withered, claw-like hand to snatch it, but Leo pivoted sharply, coldly telling her that the meat was greasy and she shouldn't touch it. He popped a piece of the rich fat into Lily's mouth, and the little girl cheered as she chewed with delight, making the old woman hop with frustration. She tried to shove her grandson into Clara's arms, making up an excuse that meat would upset a child's stomach just so she could grab it for herself. This stingy woman was so desperate for a taste that she was practically willing to dig the food out of her own granddaughter's mouth. Leo firmly slapped her dirty hand away with a look of absolute authority. He made it very clear that this gift was for the girl and the girl alone. Seeing she couldn't steal it, the old woman turned on Clara, demanding she control her brother. But for once, Clara stood her ground. She coldly told her mother-in-law that the meat belonged to Leo and it wasn't her business, before turning her back and walking into the yard with the child. Humiliated in front of the neighbors, the old woman exploded in a rage, following them inside to scream threats at Clara's face. She shrieked that having a son didn't make Clara special and threatened to have her fired from her temporary job and sent back to the village, causing little Lily to sob in fear. Leo stepped into the yard, his blood boiling, and shouted to his sister that if it came to it, she should just leave her husband and come home. He then locked eyes with the old woman and delivered a chilling promise. If Clara lost her job, he would bring 100 men to block the factory gates the very next day. He threatened to make sure her 2 precious sons ended up digging graves at the local cemetery, causing the old woman to tremble despite her attempts to act brave. Leo let out a dark, angry laugh and stepped directly into her personal space, looming over her. He warned her that her eldest son was nothing but a low-level clerk, and if pushed, Leo would beat him in the street where no one would dare help. He pointed a finger at her nose, declaring that if she ever bullied his sister again, he would settle the score with both of her sons personally. The old woman backed away, terrified by the murderous look in his eyes, as Leo handed the rest of the meat to Clara and declared that no one but Lily was to touch a bite. With her brother's fierce protection, Clara nodded through teary eyes, while Leo turned to haul the 200 pounds of cabbage inside. Leo entered the yard and tended to the horse, treating the old woman as if she were made of thin air. As his sister Clara walked him to the street, she softly urged him not to fight with their father, but Leo just nodded while telling her not to endure any more abuse. If that old woman acted up again, he'd be back. Clara smiled and asked if he really intended to hit the old lady, but Leo only sneered. If he couldn't touch her, he could certainly touch her son. Since he had made the threat, he had to make sure the old woman understood what a warning meant. Before long, he loaded the village's salt supply onto the carriage, but he didn't head home just yet. Instead, he took a long detour and staked out the entrance of the state-run salt factory. Sitting on the driver's seat, he smoked a cigarette, his eyes sharp as needles as he watched the crowd of workers leaving for the day. He knew he had to handle this carefully so as not to involve the village, and then he saw a short young man. The man sauntered out of the factory gates, joking with the guard while his eyes darted around until they landed on Leo. Leo immediately recognized the stubby figure lingering at the gate. This was his cowardly brother-in-law, Mark. If Clara hadn't delayed her marriage to care for her younger siblings, a short, unremarkable man like him would never have stood a chance. Leo flicked away his cigarette, jumped down from the carriage, and strode toward him. Mark's face turned deathly pale as he instinctively backed away, but Leo just gave a cold laugh. "Brother-in-law, why are you hiding from me?" he asked, closing the distance between them. He stepped forward and locked his arm around Mark's neck, holding him like a helpless chick. Mark struggled desperately, but he couldn't escape Leo's grip. Ever since Leo had nearly beaten him at these very gates years ago, Mark had been as terrified of him as a mouse is of a cat. "I've come a long way to see you," Leo whispered. He told Mark they were going to the roadside to get reacquainted and dragged him away from the factory grounds. Leo even paused to ask the security guard if this spot was still under the factory's jurisdiction. When the confused guard shook his head, Leo thanked him, tightened his fist, and went to work. He delivered a heavy blow right to Mark's face, the dull thud echoing as the man stumbled back and fell face first into the dirt. Mark's pathetic wails only fueled Leo's anger. Thinking of the misery Clara endured because of Mark's mother, Leo lunged at him again. He unleashed a flurry of kicks while the man rolled on the ground, begging for mercy. The security guard, fearing someone might actually die, rushed over to stop the fight. Leo let out a cold snort and stopped, brushing the dust off his clothes as he loudly announced that no one was dying today. He told the guard that this was simply his dear brother-in-law, leaving the old man staring in utter disbelief. Leo then grabbed Mark by the collar and asked if he knew why he was being beaten. Mark, sporting 2 black eyes, shook his head pitifully, so Leo leaned in close to his ear. He warned him sternly that this beating should have gone to his mother, but since Leo didn't bully old women, Mark would have to take it for her. Mark suddenly understood the situation perfectly. "Does it feel unfair to take a beating for your mother?" Leo asked, staring intensely into his eyes. "Not at all," Mark stammered. Mark was trembling from head to toe as Leo told him to keep his guard up. If his mother ever bullied Clara again, Mark would be the one to pay the price. Mark sat on the ground, completely stunned, while even the security guard now understood the reason for the beating and looked at him with nothing but contempt. With that settled, Leo leaped onto the carriage and cracked the whip. He told himself that if Clara's life became unbearable, she could just get a divorce. A temporary factory job wasn't worth her happiness. He turned the horse around and raced toward the city, arriving just as the sun began to set. Despite his empty stomach, he parked the carriage directly in front of the state-run pharmacy. As he stepped inside, the thick scent of medicinal herbs washed over him. He walked straight to the counter and slapped a handful of eleuthero roots down in front of an elderly clerk who was dozing off. The old man put on his reading glasses, took one look, and immediately identified it as Tiger's healer. Leo felt a surge of confidence knowing he was dealing with an expert. The clerk looked at Leo's rural clothes and asked how he knew about herbs, to which Leo replied it was a family tradition, mentioning his grandfather's name. The moment he mentioned his grandfather, the old man's expression changed, and he stood up straight, admiring the quality of the roots. He quickly went to the back to fetch Manager Miller. After examining the herbs for a long time, the manager decided on the spot to buy the entire lot. Then, he offered a price that made Leo's heart race, 55 cents per pound. Leo fought to hide his joy. He had brought 60 pounds of these roots that grew wild and were usually ignored by everyone. That meant $33, a fortune, considering high-quality pork was only 85 cents a pound. It was incredible to think that 2 pounds of weeds could buy over a pound of fatty meat. Suppressing his excitement, Leo asked manager Miller how much the price would increase if the herbs were properly processed. The manager held up a finger, indicating an extra 5 cents per pound. Leo secretly rolled his eyes. 5 cents was money, but if he started processing herbs in the village, everyone would be digging them up within 3 days, and the resource would be wiped out. He followed the manager to the back to weigh the haul, which came to exactly 63 pounds. The cashier counted out $34.65, the very first pot of gold Leo had earned using his knowledge of the future. Without a moment's hesitation, he turned and headed straight for the department store across the street. He had no idea that by the time he came out with his arms full of bags, by the time Leo stepped out of the store, the small fortune in his pocket had already shrunk by more than half. He hopped onto the carriage and headed for the steel plant's residential area, suddenly remembering the letter from the young volunteer, Sarah. He wandered around for a while, but couldn't find a mailbox, so he decided to ask for directions. As it turned out, the address on the envelope was only 2 blocks away, so he figured he might as well deliver it personally. He stopped an older woman nearby and asked if she knew where Sarah's family lived. Following the kind neighbor's directions, we see Leo pull the carriage over to the side of the road. He tied the horse to a utility pole at the entrance of the alley and knocked on a weathered wooden door painted in fading red. An elderly woman holding a child opened the door, and Leo introduced himself as being from the village where Sarah was currently stationed. Before he could even finish, the woman's face turned deathly pale. Her voice trembled as she asked if something had happened to Sarah in the village. Leo quickly waved his hands to reassure her, explaining he was just in town on business and wanted to drop off her letter. Sarah's mother snatched the envelope, her heart finally settling, and she stepped aside to invite him in for a drink. Just then, a young man in a steel factory uniform strode over and took the child from her, his eyes fixed on Leo like he was watching a thief. He demanded to know who Leo was, and even after the mother explained, the young man's attitude only grew more hostile. To be honest, his suspicion was a bit much. He sized Leo up with eyes full of guarded contempt, asking what his real relationship with his sister was and why she would trust him to deliver a letter. Leo stood there in disbelief, wondering if this man was even speaking the same language. It seemed his good deed was being treated like a crime, but he didn't have time for this nonsense. He gave the mother a polite nod and turned to leave, but the son suddenly stepped across the path to block his way. "Did I say you could go?" he shouted, his voice booming as he accused Leo of being a suspicious outsider. Within moments, a crowd of curious neighbors had gathered, surrounding Leo in the middle of the alley. Leo pushed the man, Mark, aside and pointed toward the alley entrance with a cold laugh, noting that his carriage was right there for everyone to see. If Mark hadn't been holding a child a moment ago, Leo might have lost his patience entirely. Instead, Mark shoved the baby into his mother's arms and began rolling up his sleeves. It looked like he was actually going to try and fight, but Sarah's mother suddenly rushed forward and threw herself between them. She begged her son to stop, her voice cracking with a desperation that seemed to hint at a much deeper family conflict. She tearfully explained that all this tension was really about the house, pouring out a lifetime of bitterness in a single breath. We learned that after Sarah's father died, the eldest son, Mark, had grown resentful of the cramped living space. His wife had been relentlessly nagging and insulting Sarah, trying to force the girl to leave. The most heartbreaking part was that the mother had a retirement slot Sarah could have used to stay in the city, but she had played dumb to force her own daughter to go to the countryside. Leo finally understood the situation. Mark wasn't worried about his sister. He was terrified she might come back and claim her share of the house. While Leo watched this family drama with a cold sneer, Sarah's mother suddenly grabbed his arm with a desperate look in her eyes. She begged him to look after Sarah back in the village. Imagine the scene. A family drives their own daughter away and then asks a complete stranger to clean up their mess. Leo looked down at the calculating old woman, finding the whole situation utterly pathetic. He wondered if they really thought he owed them anything. But as we know, Leo was never the type to be a nice guy for people who didn't deserve it. He wasn't about to be their errand boy. He told her coldly that he was only there to deliver a letter and that she should say the rest to Sarah herself. With a sharp snort, he untied his horse and leaped onto the carriage. Without looking back, he cracked the whip and let the horse carry him away, leaving the mother standing there in the dust of her own shame. The woman stood frozen as she tremblingly tore open the envelope, only to find the first sentence of the letter hitting her like a physical blow. "Mom, I don't blame you," Sarah had written. It turned out the girl knew exactly how her family had plotted against her. It was a tragic realization, to say the least. In his past life, Leo remembered that this girl eventually married a local deadbeat who left her to support the entire family alone. She didn't manage to return to the city until the late 80s, having spent her best years in a pit of a family. Some cycles of misery, it seems, are incredibly deep. However, that mess had nothing to do with him, and he had much more important business to attend to. As evening fell, he drove the carriage to the steel plant's dormitory area. He waited until the tide of workers began to pour out of the gates, finally spotting his aunt, Martha. When he called out to her, Martha froze in surprise before slapping her leg in realization, amazed at how much Leo had grown. In these times, city dwellers usually feared poor relatives showing up to beg for help. But Martha was different. She was a truly kind soul who immediately grabbed his hand. She insisted he come home for a proper dinner, showing no embarrassment as she climbed onto his salt-stained carriage. In no time at all, they pulled up in front of a 3-story Soviet-style apartment building. Naturally, this immediately drew the gossiping eyes of all the neighborhood ladies. At that moment, Leo decisively pulled back the carriage cover and began unloading over 30 pounds of fresh cabbage. The neighbors' eyes nearly popped out of their heads. In a city where supplies were so tight that even rations couldn't guarantee food, seeing this much winter produce was like witnessing a miracle. But the fresh produce was only the beginning. Next, we see Leo shoulder a massive sack of coarse salt and hand it to his aunt for pickling. This was enough to send the neighbors into a fit of pure envy. They watched with gritted teeth, wondering why Martha's rural relatives weren't here to beg, but were instead bringing a whole carriage of supplies to provide targeted relief. Under the frantic, jealous gazes of the crowd, Leo followed Martha up to the second floor. As he pushed open the door, however, his heart sank. 9 family members were squeezed into this tiny apartment, living like birds in a cramped cage. He walked over to the bed and tightly held the hand of his bedridden grandmother, offering her a box of premium pastries he had brought from out of town. When Martha saw the fancy packaging, her expression shifted instantly. She knew Leo was struggling to raise 3 younger siblings alone and felt he shouldn't spend so much. She insisted she couldn't accept such an expensive gift, but Leo was stubborn. Finally, she relented, making him promise this would be the only time. Leo nodded quickly, but just as he agreed, the door burst open and 5 half-grown children came swarming into the room like a school of fish. The leader, a boy named Kevin, froze in his tracks for a long time before tentatively calling out Leo's name. Except for the eldest, who was away at school, all of his uncle's promising children were now gathered here. Leo grinned and reached into his cloth bag to pull out his ultimate trump card. He placed a large bag of colorful fruit candies on the table. In an era of such scarcity, these sweets were a temptation on the level of a nuclear weapon for children. Martha reacted instantly, trying to push the bag back and telling him to take them home for his own siblings. To be honest, her selflessness was typical. Leo put on a troubled face and looked at her directly, noting that if she had said something sooner, he might have kept them hidden. But now that the children had seen them, taking the candy back would make it impossible for him to ever show his face there again. Martha found herself completely cornered by his logic. She was left speechless by his words. While she turned her back to chop vegetables, Leo seized the moment and stuffed the precious bag of candy into the arms of the 4th child, Toby. The boy, who had always been quick-witted, clutched the treasure and bolted. Naturally, the other children didn't just stand there. They immediately chased after him, their eyes red with excitement. You have to understand, fruit candy was a rare luxury. Most kids were lucky to even see a wrapper. This bag was a fortune. Just then, Leo's uncle, Arthur, strode into the room with a stern expression on his face. He scolded Leo, telling him that even if he had a little money, he shouldn't squander it so recklessly. Arthur had heard about Leo's canceled engagement and assumed every penny should be saved for building a house and finding a new wife. He couldn't stand seeing such waste, and then he suddenly